Welcome to the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center special event on the past, present, and future of the G7. I'm Josh Lipsky, Chair of International Economics at the Council and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center. And I'm honored today to be joined by Ambassador Bob Hormats, former Undersecretary of State, former Deputy USTR, distinguished service in the U.S. government at the pinnacle of international economics, which we're going to talk about today. And my colleague Ananya Kumar, Deputy Director, Future of Money at the Atlantic Council, who leads the Atlantic Council's work with the G7 and the G20. So we're going to jump right in. And Bob, I'm going to start with you. We want to talk a little history first. The G7 leaders are meeting next week. It is the 50th anniversary of the G7. And you were there at the rendezvous in Rambouillet, if we could say that, the first G7 summit in France. And I was wondering if you could just take us inside how it came about, why these leaders wanted to meet in the first place, and what it was like. I know you were a note taker in that meeting, and I think many of us would be interested to hear about that first summit.
Well, the first summit was really designed to be the only summit. The idea was not to have a series of meetings, but to have this one meeting at this particularly strategic time. And the origins of this were that the finance ministers had been meeting in the White House library. It was called the Library Group. It was the finance ministers of France, Germany, Britain, and the United States, who was then George Shultz, who was our Treasury Secretary. And then they decided that the problems were so substantial that they should have a meeting of the heads of state and government. The French were the main purveyors of this, largely because they wanted to deal with Ford on what they considered the critical issue at the time, which was volatility in exchange rates. The French wanted to go back to some kind of fixed exchange rate.
And just to remind people, the Nixon shock had just happened.
So this is 71,
the context.
So you had a whole series, a tsunami wave of problems. You had the post-oil embargo, which pushed oil prices up by 400%. This is done by OPEC against countries that had supported Israel. We had the aftershocks of the Nixon shock, which ended the traditional Bretton Woods system. We had a lot of protectionist pressures emerging from within these countries because their problems were very substantial. And
sounds familiar.
Yes, and then you had the other thing is that almost all the heads of state at that point were relatively new. Ford was relatively new, and three others were relatively new. They just taken office within a year and didn't really know one another, hadn't interacted. Schmidt and Giscard, of course, had, because they were both finance ministers, but the others hadn't really interacted. So the idea was to raise the level to deal with these problems at the head of state level. And also there was a feeling that there was not really sufficient unity or sense of purpose among the major allies. So the four that were in the so-called Library Group put this together. And then, of course, they felt, well, Japan was a big economy. They had to invite Japan. Then Italy, Aldo Moro, who was the prime minister, was under pressure from the Communist Party of Italy. They were growing in power. So they decided they had to invite him. He pleaded to be invited because he figured, if I'm not, then it looks like they're pushing me aside and I'll be weakened vis-a-vis the communists. And then we wanted to invite Canada, but the French had the idea this should be a very intimate group. They wanted only heads of state. They didn't want the finance ministers or the foreign ministers, so that they said, well, we don't want to add more countries. The United States insisted on Canada, but the French blocked that.
So the first G7 was a G6.
It was a G6. And also the French wanted only heads of state and government, didn't want the finance ministers and the foreign ministers in there at all. Most of the other countries said, well, our leaders are new. You have to have the ministers sitting next to them. And then they didn't want to have notes either. They said, Giscard at one point, I can remember, I mean, his English was perfect, so he was sort of going around and making the point. He didn't want any note takers. He says, what do I want all these 20-year-olds running around this room for? And,
some things never change in Washington.
That's right, that's right. And so Kissinger insisted there be an American note taker. The Brits, because he said there's an American note taker for every meeting of the president under his domain.
And what was your role at the time? You were at the National Security Council?
I was his economic advisor at the National Security Council. Yes.
Yes.
And they didn't want, at the beginning, there was supposed to be no summit, no declaration. So but we got our way, and the Brits supported us because they wanted their cabinet secretary to be the note taker. It turned out that it worked to our advantage in that John Hunt, who was the British cabinet secretary, and I were there taking notes. And then in the middle of the first session, they said, oh, we need to have some declaration. We need to have something. We just can't say nothing. So since no one was taking notes except the two note takers, we were in a very advantageous position.
This is a great lesson in note taking.
Yes, and not only that, we had to work all night because Giscard said, I'm not going to read a declaration here in France in English. So you have to take, we were obviously taking notes in English, and then they wanted to see what they were. And then Giscard came over and said, of course, you're going to translate this into French tonight. So we're there taking our English notes and dictating them in French. Fortunately, we both spoke French, so we could dictate them. It wasn't perfect French, but it was good enough.
Good enough to impress the French president.
Then the last little element of it was Giscard came over afterwards and said, can I see the notes? I want to make sure that you use the right French words for what I had in mind. And you didn't sort of translate them and then retranslate them. And then the last thing is we were not permitted, the two note takers, the inferior two note takers, were able to get in, but only through the back door. So in the end, after Giscard came over and Schmidt, who spoke both perfect English, said, well, now we're going to need those notes. And there were only two people taking notes of the first session. Afterwards, everyone else had a note taker. So he said, with a sort of smile, you can leave through the front door.
It's a good sign that it worked out.
Yeah, it was a good sign. They were very grateful in there because they wouldn't have had any recording of the first session without
and
us.
Was your takeaway, one, going in, what Ford and Kissinger wanted from that meeting, and two, did they feel it was successful from a U.S. perspective coming out of it?
Well, Ford had one problem, which was that he was, of course, succeeding Nixon, so he wanted to establish his role in the global order, and he did, I thought, an extremely good job. And the other was that the United States wanted to keep the alliance together. The trade issues and the monetary issues had caused a lot of friction, particularly when you slapped a 10% tariff on these countries.
Everything old is new again.
Yeah, so what goes around comes around. And we had gotten off the Bretton Woods system, so we're no longer converting dollars into gold, which the French didn't like.
Right.
So there were a lot of frictions, and then we wanted Ford to meet a lot of these other guys. We, I think, came away feeling good about it. As I said, it was supposed to be one-off, but then Ford sort of halfway through the year decided we should really have another one. So the United States decided we're going to have it this time, and we're going to invite Canada.
That's the
so
G7.
Speaking of, so we've come along from having these bruising battles with Canada to saying we're your advocate. We're inviting you in, and it turned out to be a very good thing. Hence, it became the G7.
Well, thank you for taking us inside there. That first one, and it's always good to remember 50 years on just how sometimes chaotic these first things can be. You don't know what's going to come of them. And this grouping, this G7, obviously has ebbed and flowed over the years in terms of its importance. And the G20 was created about 20 years ago.
Yes.
But I think it's interesting that you go back to the economic roots of the G7,
yes.
clearly talking about trade shocks and monetary issues. That hasn't always been the focus of the G7. They've gotten into more political and national security issues.
Very good point. That's a very good point. Two little addendums to that. One is, you're absolutely right. It was first called the G7 Economic Summit. After the third meeting, there was all sorts of instability in the Middle East. So they had to talk about the Middle East. They can't just sit there and not talk about it. And the other is that we forget that for a period of time, about 8 years or so, the Russians were invited because there was a feeling, well, they're not really a democracy, but we want to include them in the system. I
remember this well. Medvedev was at summits.
Medvedev,
this was early in the Obama administration.
And Putin in 2016 or something like that had a meeting in St. Petersburg of the G8 then, the G8. And then they invaded the Crimea. So the notion that we weren't including them, that we were excluding them, we were doing our best to include them. And then he invaded Crimea. So the notion that they were an aggrieved party, and that's why they're taking a more aggressive view against Uruguay really doesn't hold up when you look at the fact that we invited him to the most sacrosanct of meetings, and he actually hosted one of them, and he and Medvedev both, I think, used them. I wouldn't say they were the most supportive, but they weren't real. They were not disruptive, and they had very good Sherpas, very high level diplomats. So they were. It was a feeling when there was a time of hope that they would begin to move with more economic market forces emerging, and then they would be more acclimated. And for a while they were. For 8 years they seemed to be. But then after Putin decided, well, now I'm going to invade Crimea, it ended, and there was a unanimous vote of the G7 that this was a red line that we could not permit them to go over, and they were kicked out.
So, Ananya, let me turn to you on the present G7, Canada's G7 presidency. The leaders will meet next week because the G7 has looked different in the Trump administration. I remember the first Trump term, there was another Canadian G7 presidency. There's this great photo people can find online of Trump sitting there with his arms crossed. John Bolton's next to him, and the leaders are sort of surrounding him, asking him to agree on the communique. And now the Canadians host again, new prime minister in Canada. You've been working as the Atlantic Council, the representative for the think tank 7, where we contribute substantively. What have you seen of Canada's priorities, and what do you expect now as the leaders meet next week?
Thank you, Josh, for the question. Let me turn to you, Bob, and say what a pleasure it is to share this desk with you this morning.
It's my pleasure, because you've really been working on this, and the report you did was fabulous. I recommend it to everyone because it's very forward-looking and very thoughtful.
Thank you so much. I think it's really interesting what you've talked about in terms of the economic issues being at the heart of the G7. I think as we were coming into this year, there was a sense that the G7 would be business as usual, which for the last few years has meant economic securities, rallying around sanctions against Russia, coordinating across allies in the G7 on this, a basis assumption that what Russia has been doing has been wrong, that every G7 ally has agreed on. Now, there was a sense that that would continue this year, and then Liberation Day happened. So there's been a certain turn here between national security focus of the G7 back to economic security of the G7. So as I was a part of the T7 meetings and summit earlier this year, we had an agenda. We were going to talk about international financial architecture. We were going to talk about digital transformation. We were going to talk about energy and security issues. And then Liberation Day happened, and then all we talked about was trade and tariffs and how to talk about anything else in the context of the trade and tariffs issues. So maybe I'll end there and talk a little bit. Yeah, and say, you know, it's Carney's first G7. It's the first of its kind G7 for Donald Trump, too. He's entering in a completely different context. Going back to your...
I think that's a really interesting parallel about the new G7 members that you raised, Bob. But, you know, we have Starmer, Carney, Merz new in Germany. He's here this week in Washington.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And that is very true. And the fact is that when you go back, there are a number of issues that were similar. As you said, the trade issue, it wasn't the same kind of trade issues, but there was trade friction among the allies. And the point you made about Trump is very interesting. This will be the first time that he will have sat down with other heads of state in the Western democracies, among the Western democracies.
Second term, that's a good point,
in the second term. So, and they're all going to be very curious as to what his thoughts are, and they're going to ask him about a lot of these issues, and he is going to be on the spot to answer them. You just can't sit there with 7 heads of state around without having some clarity of expression and of concept. Otherwise, it will deteriorate into a very unproductive thing. And the other part of it is that we have the trade issue, which is critically important as one economic issue. A second is going to be sanctions against Russia, because all the other countries are going to want to up the sanctions. And if the war is still going on, they're going to want to find ways of creating unity, not just among Europeans, where they seem to have that, but bringing the United States in. And they want to know where Trump stands on this. And I think what they want to do, among other things, is lower the oil price threshold from $60 to $55 or $50 to put more pressure on the Russians if they haven't complied and done something constructive to end the war, or at least create a truce. And then you have a variety of other economic issues which relate to some of the stuff that's in your report on how do we work together with one another and with the world in developing rules for new technologies, quantum, AI, a whole range of things that are going to need rules, but none of the institutions that we have today are able to deal with those. They're barely able to survive, much less deal with new issues.
Well, and that, Ananya, to your point, is really there's so many issues to deal with, AI, quantum, tech, but you're just trying to mitigate the worst situation on a trade war versus making progress on the shared challenges.
Yes.
And I appreciate that you both brought up sanctions, because I think there was a conversation in Washington probably 4 or 5 years ago of what is the value of the G7. And then Russia invaded Ukraine, and the G7 organized in a way that I have never seen them do, at least in my time, and certainly I think it's been decades. Quick reaction, blocking Russia's sovereign assets, coordinating on sanctions, and you heard a very different conversation around the G7. People said, oh, I see the usefulness of that group.
Absolutely. There was a time in which Obama, I was the Sherpa for some of these meetings, and we flew back, and he said, at the G7, and then there was to be a G7 meeting, and then there was another a G20 meeting was scheduled. He said, why do we still have the G7? Because these same countries come to the G20s.
Obama said that to you. Why do we need a G7?
He said that. He said,
that's great. So what did you say to him?
So I said, he said, there are people who are telling me, we really don't need this. It's just extra time. Waste. I said, well,
I can see him.
and there are people on his staff. He wasn't convinced, but he was getting this pressure. And I said to him, Mr. President, if you abolish the G7, it'll be the decision you make that you will regret for the rest of your life.
Wow.
Because these are countries that at least have a basis. And it's in the first G7 declaration, a basis of support for democracy, support for freedom, support for the values that liberal democracies have. Many of these countries, in a pinch, are not going to be there. They don't share the same values. And in the end, we had this very candid conversation. He said, well, I'm not convinced, but I'm getting this kind of pressure. I said, just pay no attention. There's going to be a time when you're going to need the G7 and where the G20 will not be able to deliver because of different points of view. And one last point just to add on was at that point, we never discussed the first one. There was no discussion of China because China was really an emerging, very developing country at that point, nothing like it is today. So it was barely mentioned. The only time it was mentioned is that Schmidt had seen Mao before a couple of months earlier and gave a report on Mao's view of what was going on and found that Mao was taking very tough positions against the Soviet Union. So this is after the Nixon visit. So we found out at that point that this Sino-Soviet split is much, at least in Mao's mind, was much more intense because the language he used about the Soviets was quite abrupt and very prescient. Russians, from his point of view, were going to make trouble because he thought the Russians were thinking about starting a third world war. And then one last point he left Schmidt with is, when you see the Americans, you better find out whether they have the will to take on the Soviet Union if the Soviets decide to become more bellicose.
Well,
that's
that makes us think about what's changed and what hasn't over 50 years. And it's interesting that China was just in the periphery of the first G7, but now, Ananya, China's front and center of the G7. You saw this with the UK-US deal, the trade agreement. We don't like to call it a deal at the Atlantic Council because nothing's on paper, but at least the notional agreement where countering China, economic security vis-a-vis China was front and center. And I imagine the Trump administration is going to go to the rest of the G7 and push for this next week in Canada. Is that your read?
That's right. And you can see signs of this coming out of the finance ministers and central bank governors meeting that happened a few weeks ago. There are certain allusions there to Chinese overcapacity, how to deal with trade deficit issues across countries. There's also a big sort of call to action for working against illicit finance flows, talking very specifically about drug flows, fentanyl flows that China's been involved in as well. So there's quite a lot of allusions there to China. It is always the elephant in the room in the G7, even when it's not there in the room. Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that if they do what they should be doing, they should begin to work toward a nucleus of cooperation and how they deal with China. And for technology, on trade, a whole range of things. And at least they have to discuss it. And the question is, can they reach some degree of agreement on it, just as they have to find some level of agreement on the question of sanctions against Russia. It's a different issue, but you have China and the whole notion of a new international economic order led by China. What is the G7 going to say, or what do they think, or at least in private, what do the leaders think? Yeah. Because if they're operating on different levels, it'll make it much easier for Chinese to play that role, and the West will not be unified in how it reacts.
Yeah, and on your tech point, it's very acute there, right? There's a lot of work in the G7 that's happened on data free flow with trust. There's a lot of work that's happened on countering proliferation of unsafe AI and quantum technologies and how we're going to build our defense systems against it. It's very hard to go back to that issue. That is the point I keep coming back to when you're in the midst of the trade war, right? Yeah. So there's every leader that's coming wants to talk to Trump about exchange rate issues, hard monetary problems, and trade issues. That's what Japan wants, as we've seen. That's what Mexico wants, that's coming in as a guest during the G7 too. So they're really looking to Trump to provide some guidance there. And I think once that happens, we can move to the sort of enduring challenges that the G7 has.
I think that's right. And without that, there'll just be a lot of countries sort of sitting there at the table arguing with one another. There needs to be some common sense of what we're after in terms of dealing with the trade within this group, but also internationally. And I think the other is that, just a derivative point, is that the original declaration of the G7 was also meant to serve as a reminder to these countries that we're having at that point, we're having issues on trade, issues on monetary issues, and monetary instability, that we all share common values and that we have an interest in working these things out together in a way that supports our common democratic values.
Right. And that is really what has underpinned the G7 as an organizing principle. It's not the world's 7 largest economies. It's 7 advanced democracies
with similar principles,
who share some sense of values. And that, I think, is what is questioned right now, and Ananya, to your point, by the other members. Well, do we share the same sense of values, or is this all about bilateral trade deficits between us?
That's exactly, and that's the open question. That's very well put. And then there was a worry at that point that if there was not unity among the G7, each of these countries would resort to economic nationalism, through protectionism. And so the idea, and if you look at the declaration, right at the beginning, and every one of the leaders, every one of them said at the beginning, we have to have a very clear understanding that we share common values and we have to work, each country is responsible for supporting those values collectively and in the way they're governed. So the notion of economic nationalism is just going to be very divisive, and that will undermine us internally, undermine our alliance. And they didn't want to talk about NATO, but at that point they did. They said it would undermine NATO, and it would make us look weak in the eyes of the Kremlin because we were divided. And the only way we can really put pressure on the Kremlin, being in the middle of the Cold War, was to show that we were resolute and all these divisions could be overcome.
And Ananya, I think it's so interesting, the point you brought up about guests at the G7. People don't realize this. We think, here's who are the members. But it's both the G20 and the G7 have grown in guests, observers, visitors. They have different terminology depending on the summit. Do you find that valuable? I know there's a lot of jockeying about which countries get invited and guest status and don't, depending on who's the host in any given year. Yeah,
so the big news this week is that India is likely not invited as a guest, which is the first time since 2019 that it hasn't been invited. And I think guest countries view this as a signal of their importance. To the other G7 countries, they view this as a way of building relationships with all of them together, vis-a-vis one-to-one, as you were talking about. I honestly don't know if it matters. Bob, I'm interested if you think so.
You raise an excellent point, and that is the guest invitation was seen as a very positive act on the part of these Western industrialized countries.
Welcome to the exclusive club.
Welcome to the exclusive club. And we, at that point, there were no guests in the first couple of 3 or 4 or 5 summits, but afterwards, it was hard enough to get a representative of the EU invited. There was no representative.
That's true.
So much changed.
And then that changed. But the guest idea is very important. There was one point during these discussions when there was a concern raised by several of the leaders that after the oil embargo and the pressure, that there would be other embargoes and other countries who were going to use leverage. If it weren't oil producers, could be producers of raw materials. There could be, or other things that the West needed from the global South. It wasn't called that then, but these countries would get together and would put pressure on the G7 countries by using leverage on things that they exported, just like the oil exporters were using leverage on the oil they exported. We really were concerned about that. And as a result, there was a paragraph or 2 that said that we in the West have to work more closely with the developing countries. And they were worried about what they called the other countries, then not the global South, but what they are now, global South, would put pressure on for what was called a new international economic order.
Exactly.
And they proto-BRICS kind of group.
Absolutely. And so there was a major effort that was really led by the French and the British in particular to have positive statements about our cooperation with the developing countries.
I think that's absolutely right. I will say the presidency gets to decide who the guests are. So it defers year to year, and the presidency wants to have it be a show of their cooperation with other emerging markets. I'll also say on that point, we haven't talked about Canada being the president so far. Obviously, Carney is a new elected leader of Canada, but Canada-U.S. relationship is at such a tense point that it's been interesting interacting with Canadian colleagues on the other side. I know parts of our team were in Canada as the tariffs were announced against it, but there's a certain friction here between the G7 members thinking that they're being treated worse than the sort of China and Russia dynamic with the U.S.
Oh yes. You're absolutely right. And
what is the value of being a G7
exactly
ally?
Yeah, if you're going to be treated worse than, for instance, with tariffs. Which country did not have tariffs slapped on them? Russia. And they were slapped on
everyone
else, including your closest allies. And I think the Canada point that you raised is extremely good. Mark Carney and I worked at Goldman Sachs together. Our offices were like 10 feet away from one another. So we spent a lot of time, and I've talked to him since he was governor of the Bank of Canada. And he understands that Canada, if it wants to play a greater global role, which he does, as Trudeau did too, but he didn't get along with Trump. Carney does get along somewhat better with Trump. But I think we'll see a lot of leadership coming from Canada. We wanted Canada in there, as I mentioned, in the second summit. And they were quite slighted that they weren't invited to the first one. We wanted another country from our hemisphere.
That makes sense.
And so we decided we would, and they were our closest friend and ally. So I think that the signal in how we get on with Canada is going to be important to the other countries, because they're going to say, if you can't get on with your closest neighbor and friend and an ally that helped your people when they escaped from when the Iranians took our embassy and they gave us a place to stay, 6 of our diplomats. This is a kind of country that the Americans should work with. If you don't do it with Canada, what about us? And I think that they have to be convinced that they are important from an economic point of view, from a cultural point of view, from the point of view of common values, and that their relationship with us is critically important to underpinning NATO. And NATO won't get mentioned in detail, but it's certainly clear that there's an economic dimension to our security, and this is it.
Yeah, and they speak both English and French there, so there's not a lot of translation.
Back to the
issues.
roots of
Yeah.
the G7.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Carney has led 2 different G7 central banks. So I
Yes,
think
he
this
has.
maybe
Yeah.
gives him some ability to return to the economic roots.
And he's a
of the
very
G7.
bright guy, and he knows how to play politics, and he's going to stand up to the United States. Trump's already seen that.
This is really...
And I think the others, it used to be the Chinese would come to the Canadians and say, how is it that you have all these differences with the Americans, but you still get along with them? And Canada was sort of the instructor for these countries. You get on with the Americans, even though you're tough on softwood lumber and all these other things. So they would try to get from the magic potion that the Canadians used to work with the U.S. but still disagree with the U.S.
One thing I remember from the first Trump term when I was at the IMF was I think the White House and Trump like the home field advantage of the Oval Office. You've certainly seen that in the
Yes.
past few weeks with
It's
some of
their
the meetings
theater.
he said.
Yeah.
This is more of a neutral playing field.
Yes.
He's with 6 other leaders. They're all at the same level. And you can see sometimes there's a bit of discomfort on his end in that setting. So I'll be very curious to see, to your point about how he comes the first time in the second term to a setting which was not always, I think, something that was his strong suit in the
That
first term.
he couldn't script.
Yes, couldn't strip.
It can't be his theater. If it's anything, it's Mark Carney's theater.
That's right.
But then Carney is a serious guy, and he's not going to want to play theatrics with this.
Yeah.
This is his first big meeting. He's just been
Yeah, wants it to go smoothly
Yeah.
He
for
wants to go
a whole range
smoothly,
of reasons.
but he wants it to come out with results.
That's true.
And I think that's this is a result-oriented guy, and he's a
So
smart
let me
guy.
ask you both that question. What would a successful G summit in Canada look like, given the context? And then I have one final question for you both that's a bit provocative, but I think we need to challenge some of the assumptions about the G7. But what's a successful Canadian G7 summit
I think at the
next week?
base level, it would be great to have a communique because
Yeah.
that would mean that the leaders are agreeing on
Yeah.
the basics of the G7,
Yes.
that the process that's occurred over the last year has been productive, and that France has a framework to take on for the next
They have the next
presidency.
G7
Yes.
presidency. Yeah.
So I think that's where I'll end. Bob, what do you think?
Well, I think it's important. I think it's important that they say something constructive about cooperation in support of Ukraine.
I see.
That's
Which has been a
something-
sticking point.
Yeah.
as
So
we
which has
know.
been a sticking
Yeah.
point. Something supportive about the fact that democracies here have to stand up to Putin in a robust way. That this is war. If Trump makes the point the war is going on too long and it's too nasty and too many people are being killed, then it stands to reason you have to have something bold in support of Ukraine that makes Putin sit up and say the allies that he wanted to divide are now more unified. And the third is the Chinese have to see that they want to play a greater role, that the West also is still, Chinese have viewed the East rising and the West in decline. We have to demonstrate by our collaboration that we are not declining, that we're working together, that the Europeans are getting their act together, and we're all getting our act together on trade, and the Europeans are putting more money into their security. And the Japanese will want to see that because they don't want to be the only American security partner in the Western Pacific. So those are the kind of things, and that the heads of state really are on the same wavelength, because if it looks like we're divided, both the Chinese and the Russians the Russians, for one reason, they want to divide up NATO and want to weaken the internal cohesion of Western countries. But the Chinese are now saying if the West's so divided, we're going to be the ones who call the shots in the new world order and the rules for AI or quantum or any of these other
That's
things.
a huge risk. And if we think about the G20, which is coming in
Yes.
November in South Africa, the U.S. is boycotting this G20. That is specifically about their feelings about South Africa's politics, not about the G20 as an institution, but it opens some of the vacuum that you're talking about here in terms of other countries.
If the Chinese see a vacuum and see the West divided, they're going to want to play a greater role, and already are doing so, in shaping the new economic and global order of the 21st century. And they want to do that. 10 years ago they wouldn't have. Now they want to do that, and Xi clearly wants to do that. And how the West performs will be an indication of whether he can, or whether the idea of Western democracies, liberal democracies, is strong enough to be the magnet for a new order, or the changing order, or the evolving order.
Yeah. Ananya?
I'll also say on that point, so the US is hosting the G20 next year. France is hosting the G7. This is going to be the first time in a long time that has happened at the same time. There's a way for the G20 and G7 to play together there that hasn't existed for a while now. And I think that would be of advantage to the US.
I
point.
agree. It strengthens the American leadership role
Exactly.
to be able to do this.
It's a huge opportunity.
And Trump has to see, and if it turns out the other way in America, and this fragments and turns into a place of discord as opposed to a coordinated strategy for 2 or 3 or 4 of the things I mentioned, then it's going to be very hard to pull back, because this is the moment. This is a unique chance for Trump to show that he can be a constructive leader of Western democracies rather than a destructive one. It's a chance for Europe to show it's united amongst itself and vis-a-vis the United States. It's a chance to show that we're interested in pushing Putin back, supporting our friends in Ukraine, and to show the Japanese and the other Asians that even though only one Asian country is there, we're still thinking of playing a greater role in Asia. And last, to tell the global South, we want to play a more constructive role vis-a-vis you collectively.
I think that's such an important note, and it kind of leads me to my last question for you both, which is the criticism of the G7 in recent years has been, well, look, these countries don't hold the same economic power globally they did 50 years ago in the aggregate. They don't actually control or should not control as much of the policy agenda. We have the G20 framework. And so I wanted to ask you both to kind of take that head on, and you got to it a little bit, Bob, but what is the value of the G7 going forward?
I'm just going to reiterate Bob's great point here. It's unique. The G7 is unique because all leaders of the G7 agree to the premise of democratic values. And that doesn't happen in the G20.
Clearly not.
And there's a lot of dysfunction in the G20 because of that reason, right? There's a lot of different kinds of agendas, and economic sovereignty plays a bigger role in the G20 because of it. The G7 is a way for these countries to agree with the assumption of democratic values, and then to say, here's what you can do with an open market economy. Here's the benefits that you can have. And we're not going to shy away from your issues. I think we were talking about why emerging markets should be a part of the G7. And a big part of it is debt restructuring, debt issues, those bigger macro financial issues that impact everyone, not just these countries. So it's a model for how the world should work in a cooperative body. And I think that's the value.
Beautifully put. And I think that the G7, the argument is made the G7 isn't as large a share of global GDP as it was. That's certainly true. And certainly from a military point of view, there are other major contestants for being a great power. Obviously, China, in terms of its Navy, in terms of its the PLA, is certainly a major player, certainly in the Western Pacific, but also wants to be a big global player as well. So the key, from at least my point of view, is not that the G7 is going to dictate what the rest of the world is going to look like or should look like, but it can prove by example, going back to your point, that democracies and free market systems can be functional, can be effective, can serve the needs of their people, can avoid serious partisan internal rifts that pull them apart, can serve as models for good governance, for collaboration internally and avoidance of these major partisan divisions, and work together externally in a constructive way. And I think that's going to be extremely important from their point of view, from the world's point of view. And the other is that the success of the G7 has not necessarily been in trying to change the system itself. It is to form the nucleus of ideas that then countries in the G7 go out and propagate with other countries or discuss with other countries. This is true. There's a small group of points of contact on AI.
That's true.
And I think there should be more of those. There should be small working groups within the G7 that come up with good collaborative, cooperative ideas amongst themselves, not with the thought of pushing them on other countries, but because they're so important to creating a well-functioning global order that if this group can agree on the substance and on the degree of collaboration amongst themselves, then we have a chance on the basis of the power of the ideas and the influence that the G7 does have, and it's still substantial, not as much, but it is, can work with other countries and bring them along with these, in support of these rules. So it's not dominating, not pushing ideas, but coming up with good ideas amongst themselves and then getting other countries to accept those as the basis for further and broader scale collaboration with one another and being a positive influence on the system rather than a divisive one.
I think that's a great reminder of the value of the G7. And I think this next summit in Canada coming next week is actually one of the most important in the 50-year history, because the rest of the leaders are looking for a commitment from this country, from the United States, that they still believe in all of the things that you just outlined. That both
this
of you
may
discussed.
turn out to be one of the most consequential summits, G7 summits ever, depending on how it comes out. It could be consequential in a bad way to show how demonstrate to the world that these countries that have the same views on most things can't get along.
Right.
In which case it's very divisive internally, and then it shows the world something that the world is not going to get leadership from the G7. If it comes out in a collaborative way, which would surprise a number of countries because a lot of people aren't expecting great things from this for the reasons that you mentioned. But if they can make progress on 3 or 4 key issues and show collaborative support for one another on dealing with some of the challenges that the global economy faces, it can be a very impressive demonstration of why democracies and free societies can work well together and work well internally and can play a leadership role in the world.
Good. On that note, I will thank you both. Thank you for your time, for your commitment, both of you, for your work on the G7 process, which I think is a critical part of U.S. leadership, not just in the global economy, but U.S. leadership more broadly. So thank you for being with us this morning. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're going to continue to follow next week's G7 summit in Canada. We have a range of analysis coming out from the Atlantic Council Geoeconomic Center, where we unpack the different economic situations in each country, where we look at the way forward on the challenges they're facing, AI, semiconductors, trade, and everything that will be on the agenda at the summit. So stay with us at the Atlantic Council. We wish everyone a pleasant rest of the day.